When protesters corner Barron Trump, roaring bikers roll in, but what they do next leaves everyone speechless and questioning everything. It was a day that seemed destined for chaos. The streets of Charleston, South Carolina, were teeming with energy as a crowd of protesters formed near the edge of Marion Square. Signs with bold, angry slogans bobbed in the air, and chants grew louder with every passing second. The event taking place nearby was no ordinary gathering. It was a private reception for the youngest Trump, Barron, who had recently stepped into the public eye for a high-profile charity initiative. The protest wasn't about him. Not entirely. The crowd's anger was rooted in broader frustrations, grievances they felt were ignored. Yet Barron's name had become a symbol for them, a lightning rod in the storm of their discontent. The air felt thick, charged with anticipation. Police officers in yellow vests had set up barricades, keeping the protesters a safe distance from the venue. Despite their efforts, the tension was palpable. Protesters pressed forward, their voices rising as the limousine carrying Barron pulled up to the hotel's private entrance. "Shame, shame," they shouted in unison, their words echoing through the square. The young man, tall and poised despite his years, emerged from the car under the watchful eyes of security. He didn't flinch. Instead, he walked briskly inside, ignoring the cacophony. The crowd didn't calm down. If anything, they grew louder, their anger more focused. It was clear that something was about to break, but no one expected what came next. But before tempers could boil over, a new sound cut through the chants, a distant rumble that grew louder by the second. The protesters turned their heads toward the noise. At first it was hard to make out what it was, a low, steady rumble like a storm rolling in. Then it grew louder, and the unmistakable sound of motorcycle engines filled the air. From the corner of King Street, a procession of bikes appeared. They weren't a chaotic swarm, but a disciplined line of gleaming machines, each ridden by figures clad in leather jackets and helmets. American flags fluttered from several bikes, catching the afternoon light as they moved steadily toward the square. The crowd's energy faltered for a moment. The chants grew quieter, replaced by murmurs of confusion. Some protesters looked uneasy, unsure of what this new development meant. The bikers weren't carrying signs or yelling slogans. They weren't part of the protest. They just rolled in, engines growling like a pack of wolves approaching uncertain territory. The line of bikes stopped just short of the barricades, engines idling as the riders dismounted. Their leader, a tall man with silver-streaked hair and a confident gait, removed his helmet and surveyed the scene. His jacket bore the insignia of a local biker group, one known for its patriotic values and community involvement. The crowd watched them cautiously. Suspicion mingled with curiosity. Who were these bikers? Then why were they here? Were they there to escalate the conflict, or was there another purpose behind their arrival? But before anyone could act, the leader stepped forward, his voice cutting through the noise with unexpected clarity. The leader's voice rang out with surprising authority. "We're not here to fight," he said, his tone calm yet firm. "We're here to remind everyone what this country's really about." The protesters froze, their chants abruptly silenced. Even the officers at the barricades seemed momentarily stunned, unsure how to interpret the unfolding scene. The leader raised his hands, palms open, signaling he wasn't a threat. His fellow bikers stood behind him, an imposing yet strangely peaceful presence. "We've seen enough division," he continued, his voice steady. "You're angry, and you've got your reasons. But let me ask you, what's the point of tearing each other down? This young man you're yelling at, he's not the one making the rules you're upset about. He's just a kid." A ripple of murmurs passed through the crowd. Some protesters lowered their signs slightly, their grip loosening as they processed his words. Others remained defiant, their faces set in hardened expressions. But the leader wasn't finished. "We came here today because we believe in protecting people, not just with our strength, but with our actions. So here's what we're gonna do." He gestured toward the barricades and then to his group. "We're gonna stand right here, not for him, not for you, for the idea that we can handle our differences without tearing each other apart." The bikers began forming a human wall between the protesters and the barricades, standing shoulder to shoulder. Their presence was neither confrontational nor submissive. It was resolute. They weren't taking sides. They were creating a buffer. A visual reminder that escalation didn't have to be the answer. For a moment the square was silent, except for the hum of engines still idling in the background. Even the most vocal protesters seemed caught off guard by the sheer audacity of the gesture. But as the tension hung in the air, a single voice from the crowd shattered the quiet. And what happened next changed everything. From the middle of the protesters, a woman's voice cut through the silence. "Why are you protecting him? He's part of the problem." Her words, sharp and defiant, reignited a flicker of anger among some in the crowd. Heads turned toward her and murmurs of agreement rippled through the group. The biker leader didn't flinch. Instead, he turned toward the woman, meeting her gaze directly. "I'm not protecting him," he said, his voice steady. "I'm protecting the idea that we can disagree without tearing each other apart. You've got your right to protest, and he's got his right to be here. That's what freedom means. But screaming at each other doesn't solve a damn thing." The woman hesitated, her resolve wavering. She opened her mouth to respond but paused, as if weighing her next words. Before she could speak, an older man near the back of the crowd raised his hand and said, "He's right, you know." All eyes shifted to the man who looked more like someone you'd see at a hardware store than at a protest. "I don't like the Trumps any more than you do," he said. "But this kid didn't choose his family. Yelling at him ain't gonna fix what's broken." The crowd seemed to falter again, caught between their anger and an emerging sense of self-awareness. A few people began lowering their signs entirely, their expressions softening. Others glanced at each other, as if silently questioning the effectiveness of their protest. The bikers didn't move. They stood firm, their presence a quiet but powerful reminder of what the leader had said, that there was a better way to handle this moment. But just as the tension seemed to ease, a young protester stepped forward, his actions threatening to shift the mood once again. A young protester, barely in his 20s, pushed through the crowd, his face flushed with emotion. He held a sign high above his head, its bold letters accusing Barron of sins he hadn't committed. "This is exactly why we're out here," he shouted, pointing toward the bikers. "People like you, standing in the way of change." The biker leader turned toward the young man, his expression calm but unwavering. "Son," he said, his voice low and measured, "change doesn't happen when you're screaming in someone's face. It happens when you show them a better way." The young man didn't back down. He took another step forward, his grip tightening on the sign. For a moment the crowd seemed to hold its breath, unsure of what would happen next. The bikers remained still, their stance steady but non-threatening. Then, unexpectedly, one of the bikers, a middle-aged woman with a weathered face and a soft voice, stepped forward. "Listen," she said gently, addressing the young protester. "We're not here to stop you from speaking. But have you thought about what you're really trying to say? Is it anger or is it hope for something better?" Her words seemed to hit him harder than the biker leader's earlier remarks. His grip on the sign loosened and his shoulders sagged slightly. I just want things to change," he muttered, his voice quieter now. "And they can," the woman replied, stepping closer. "But not like this. Not by tearing down someone who doesn't even hold the power you're fighting against." The young protester glanced back at the crowd, many of whom were now watching in silence. Slowly, he lowered his sign, his expression a mix of frustration and introspection. The tension in the square seemed to shift, the anger that had fueled the protest dissipating into something quieter, something that felt closer to understanding. But before the moment could settle fully, a new development caught everyone off guard, shifting the focus once more. The sharp sound of clapping broke the silence. A man in a business suit standing near the hotel entrance stepped forward and began applauding. His gesture, unexpected and out of place, drew everyone's attention. "You've got guts," he called out, addressing both the bikers and the protesters. "All of you." The man's bold action seemed to diffuse the remaining tension like a slow release of steam. A few others in the crowd hesitantly joined in, their applause tentative at first but growing louder. It wasn't a celebration. It was more of an acknowledgement, an uneasy truce in a moment of chaos. Then something even more surprising happened. A young woman from the protest group stepped past the barricades, her hands raised to show she wasn't a threat. She walked up to the biker leader, her face a mix of determination and vulnerability. "I don't agree with everything you said," she admitted, her voice steady. "But you're right about one thing. We're not gonna fix anything this way. The biker leader nodded slowly. Takes guts to say that, he replied. It's not about who's right or wrong, it's about where we go from here. As if inspired by her courage, more protesters began stepping forward, setting down their signs. Some approached the bikers, exchanging quiet words and cautious nods. It was far from a resolution, but it was a start, a moment of understanding in a sea of division. The police, who had been on edge for hours, began to relax, their hands moving away from their radios and batons. The tension that had gripped the square finally started to dissolve. But just as the scene seemed to reach a fragile peace, Barron Trump himself appeared at the hotel entrance, sending a fresh wave of anticipation rippling through the crowd. Barron Trump stepped out of the hotel, flanked by security but noticeably composed. At just 18, he carried himself with a quiet confidence that contrasted sharply with the chaos that had unfolded. His appearance caught everyone off guard, protesters, bikers, and onlookers alike. For a moment it seemed like he would simply walk to his waiting car and leave the scene behind. But instead, he stopped at the edge of the hotel steps, his gaze sweeping across the crowd. Without a microphone or prepared speech, he raised his voice just enough to be heard. I know most of you don't like my family, he began, his words deliberate and unguarded. And maybe you have your reasons. But I'm not here because of politics. I'm here because I believe in helping people who need it. The crowd was eerily quiet now, hanging on his every word. Even the young protester who had earlier held the sign so tightly was watching with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. I didn't ask for the life I was born into, Barron continued, his tone steady, but I can choose how I live it. And today, I'm here to support kids who don't have anyone else. Kids who need hope. His words seemed to cut through the barriers of anger and misunderstanding that had divided the square. For a moment, he was no longer just the youngest Trump. He was a teenager, standing alone in front of a volatile crowd, trying to bridge a gap that felt impossible to close. Maybe we don't agree on much, he said, glancing briefly at the bikers, then the protesters. But if we can agree that helping people matters more than tearing each other down, then maybe today wasn't wasted. The silence that followed was profound. It wasn't the absence of noise but the presence of something unspoken. A realization perhaps that this moment could mean more than just a standoff. But before anyone could fully process his words, Barron turned and walked calmly to his car, leaving behind a crowd that was no longer the same. As the car pulled away, the crowd stood in a kind of suspended stillness. The protesters, bikers, and onlookers who had moments ago been separated by barriers, both physical and ideological, now found themselves united in an awkward, unspoken truce. The weight of Barron's words lingered in the air, mingling with the hum of idling motorcycles and the soft rustle of discarded signs. The young protester who had lowered his sign earlier turned to the biker leader. He's just a kid, he said, almost to himself. I guess I never thought about it like that. The biker leader gave a small nod, his weathered face reflecting something between exhaustion and hope. Neither did I at his age, he replied. But if we're gonna make things better, it's gotta start with conversations like this, not screaming matches. A woman from the protest group stepped forward, her voice breaking the quiet. Maybe we're all more alike than we think, she said, addressing no one in particular. Her words carried a note of hesitation, but also of sincerity. One by one, people began to disperse. Some shook hands with the bikers. Others simply walked away, lost in thought. The bikers mounted their motorcycles, their engines roaring to life once more. But this time, the sound wasn't intimidating. It was a reminder of how different forces could coexist without clashing. By the time the square was empty, it was as if a storm had passed, leaving behind a clearer sky. What began as a day of confrontation ended with a shared moment of introspection. A reminder that even the deepest divides could be bridged if people were willing to listen and understand. Moments like this don't happen often, but they remind us of what's possible when we put humanity above division. If this story resonated with you, consider sharing it with someone who might need the message today. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that inspire conversation and hope.